Super. Well, welcome. I hope you've grabbed a cup of coffee or got a glass of water or maybe even some lunch at your side. I'm Lacey Bryant. I'm here both in my role as Vice President for CILIP. Delighted today that we have two groups coming together, the members of two groups coming together to look at a really important topic. And I'm also currently Chief Knowledge Officer for the NHS in England. So it's a real pleasure. Welcome. Look, we're all here because we're curious as to how advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning are beginning to make an impact on our work, on knowledge products, knowledge solutions, and our work as knowledge and information managers in whatever sector we work. And of course, really welcoming members today from the Government Information Group and both from Knowledge and Information Management Group as well. Our speakers are going to open a window on current applications and also developments in machine learning. So beginning by mercilessly lifting some lyrics from the Moody Blues, "Time waits for no one at all." You thought you'd seen it all before, you really thought you knew what's in the future. We will decide. Probably all too young to ever listen to the Moody Blues, but I advocate that particular one to you. It's called Driftwood. So look, we're going to go on to a great session now. I will be asking both Dr. Andrew Cox and then Dr. Kelcey Swain to speak. The pattern of the session is going to be that we're going to ask you to stay on mute. We're going to ask you to use the chat to add questions and comments. I'll go first to Andrew and ask him to speak, and then we'll take 5 or 6 minutes to look at your questions and comments. Then I'll turn to Kelcey, exactly the same pattern. And our ambition is to leave 15-20 minutes for a much wider discussion across this group. So please be bearing that in mind too. And at the end of this, both groups will, somebody will say a few words, but about both groups, both GIG and the KIM groups. So without ado, without any more delay, let me hand straight over to Dr. Andrew Cox. Andrew and I have done work in the past together. Andrew is at University of Sheffield, the iSchool there. Much of your work, Andrew, relates to the information professions and our response to contemporary trends in AI, but also datafication, managerialism, great words there. So AI waits for no one. Over to you, please, Andrew. Thank you.
Brilliant. I want to share my screen, but I think we need to close the opening screen. Ah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Andrew Cox from the University of Sheffield. I'm also, as it happens, the convener of the IFLA Special Interest Group on AI, and I would invite you to have a look at our website. I'm sure we'll share the slides after the event, so the link is on there. I'm also actually the chair of the ASIST Special Interest Group on AI. Enough about me. I want to use the time to talk about how we as a profession are going to be affected by AI. So I think fundamentally we should be really welcoming the impact of AI on access to knowledge and the creation of knowledge. AI has been used for quite a long time in recommendation and search, adaptivity of content. We're seeing better and better translation tools. Events like this are transcribed and captioned. That's it, making information more accessible. Generative AI is really improving summarization. And I think there's applications of AI to much of the content that we as information professionals kind of look after. Of course, so I think overall, AI is really good for access to knowledge, and that's what we're all about. Of course, it also creates problems that we're pretty familiar with, like inaccuracy of information, the hallucination on ChatGPT, but also the ability to create fake information, the bias or the unwarranted bias that's often in tools, privacy concerns, filter bubble effects, the lack of explainability of AI. These are all things I think really we're quite familiar with, but it's a positive picture overall. Generative AI in particular, obviously, is something at the forefront of our minds at the moment. It's allowing users to ask questions in ordinary language and get back, rather than a list of results, some answers. And that's really good for access to knowledge. It's going to change expectations about search that we have to respond to because our search tools maybe don't yet have that capability. If you look at things like Copilot as well, there's some really exciting potential of, and maybe you're already using Copilot, to change the content and tone and length of emails, draft documents or presentations from a prompt, or draft a presentation from a document, do basic Excel activities, summarize meetings, even identify action points. Maybe Copilot isn't perfect yet. I don't think it'll ever be perfect. It's got lots of problems, but we've got to accept that this is really, really powerful kind of tool for using and creating information. And we know that this will have, this is from some of the CB Insights predictions about AI, which I'll come back to a few times. It's going to have an impact on productivity. Of course, it also has its downside potentially. So you may have picked up this IPPC report from about a month ago that was reported in The Guardian anyway as predicting an AI apocalypse to jobs in the UK. If you read the report, I think it's quite balanced, and actually there's a lot of positives as well, but there is a risk to jobs, and there isn't really time to go through. I will recommend that report. The explanation they give, I haven't got time again really to fully explain, but they're saying we're now at this phase 0 of playing around with AI. As we get to use AI and in a more embedded way, we'll move through these phases. And their prediction is at the current state of things, 13% of kind of routine office tasks are somewhat vulnerable to generative AI. But they're saying that if we get this integrated AI as a further phase, 70, 80% of tasks that we normally do in office work, which a lot of information work is basically office work, these will be easily done by AI. You can see where AI is not so good in interpersonal communication tasks and obviously manual tasks. So I think the public response to AI of sort of mixture of optimism and concern is justified. Even these sort of reports that predict the impact on work, they're sort of sometimes predicting huge job losses, sometimes not. So I think there's a lot of emotion and fear in the workplaces around AI. And there's been a debate in the literature about what the impact of AI will be. I personally think it'll be quite a slow process, and we should see it as part of other digital transformations happening. But we can think of different ways that AI could affect work. It could replace roles. It could control how we do work. In other words, maybe like the Amazon driver, we're just like told where to go exactly. It could be that some people benefit, some people just get less interesting work. But it could be there's very positive effects on work. Hopefully we've got some sort of agency in those choices. There's also, I think we should also think in that report from IPCC as reported in The Guardian, there isn't just an equal effect across the industry. It's women, ethnic minorities whose work is particularly under threat. And there's some reasons to believe that AI, the whole AI agenda, could in some ways increase workforce inequalities. And if you look at this New York Times picture of the key figures of contemporary AI, you can see why. It's white men, well, most white men, but men creating these tools, and we've already had experience and realized that they often create tools that fit their assumptions about the world. But this is my main slide, really. And this is going back to this idea of like Copilot and these tools that integrate with Office functions. How are they going to affect work? And I think many of the effects are things that we, as information professionals and knowledge managers, have a real stake in sort of addressing. So we know with generative AI, you have to be good at applying prompts. So we need to train people in being better at prompting. It's similar to search, I guess, but a slightly different sort of syntax, I suppose. And also, Copilot introduces sort of meta prompts that are available to everybody. So we need to be involved in that, thinking about what kind of prompts people are being given when they're using these tools. Generative AI, it may be really great at producing content, but it needs to be checked for accuracy. We need to also think about, so if we're letting it do some statistical analysis, we need to think of that if it's logical, appropriate analysis. So we still need that critical view of information, but it's even more embedded in what everybody in the workplace is doing. We also need to drive AI, we need data quality and data quantity. There's lots of issues around the data that's used to train AI. So that's, again, something where we can play a role, I think. AI really works well when you're using all the tools of, say, Microsoft, or all the tools of Google, because it's integrating content across different functions. So again, there's this drive towards integration. We also know there's lots of issues around how do people share information and knowledge in organizations? How do we tag things that need to be kept secure? This is quite hard stuff to do. We know that because that's the kind of stuff we work around. AI accelerates the need to address those kind of issues. And of course, there's the issue also of bias. For example, I'm guessing that in meeting reports, okay, an automatic summary of the meeting is generated, but I think it's going to hear some voices much clearer than others. And that probably goes along the lines of sort of, maybe people whose English is not their first language, they're going to be kind of almost silenced by generative AI if it's not accurate about their voices. Again, we've got some important, if we're introducing things like Copilot into the workplace, this is new ways of working with information. So there's a big change management challenge there, training people up, overcoming fear and so forth. It's intensifying safety and security issues. It's increasing fears about surveillance. And there's also potentially, I think, general impacts on the information culture. More and more misinformation and disinformation that's very hard to distinguish from the truth or accurate information. An impact on how we read text. If we get a text from somebody and we think it's being generated by AI, do we trust it the same? Do we see it as sincere? Things like opacity and unintelligibility. So I think these are familiar issues for information and knowledge management. And so our role in this AI scene is really important. It emphasizes our importance. I haven't got time to go through this slide. It's again, it's a very interesting paper thinking about how information work in general might change because of AI. For example, we shift from having a holistic view of an information task to just having to check the results out of generative AI. It's quite a big change of attitude and thinking. We also know there's this desperate search for data. There'll be lots of demands formal data, there's the risks around disinformation and misinformation, there's the sustainability issues. But I think my conclusion really is our information and KM skills and values and ethics are even more important than before. And that's really my conclusion.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Andrew, for that really spread across the whole field and some of the implications for us, the risk that we need to manage, but also around our skills. So a couple of questions already, but I'll answer one myself, which is why the speed of the presentation, and that's because we were particularly asked today to allow in this group some time, not simply for a broadcast of our speakers presenting, but that they could be wider discussion, which would allow you also as two groups coming together to raise issues that you're concerned about and therefore feed the programme going forward. That's my understanding, and that was my brief. So let me pick up a couple of the questions then. So first of all, what's the difference between the term, what's meant by the term AI? What's the difference between AI and generative AI? Can I ask you, Andrew, to come in on that one?
That's a big question. I suppose there's multiple forms of AI. At one time, we were being told AI was all about prediction. There's AI that's very useful for finding patterns in data. Generative AI is about creating content, images, text. So I guess the big challenge of AI in a way is it pops up in different places looking differently. Sometimes it's used in one task, sometimes in another. I think, say, if you're in a library, I think it can pop up in multiple ways. So, yeah, it's pretty hard to disentangle what AI is.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I've always seen it as being about creating content, presenting content. Kelcey, do you have a view on that before I pick up another couple of questions?
No, Andrew's done a great job there.
Splendid. Okay. So we've got a question from Hannah. How do you think knowledge and library service professionals, specialists can adapt to these current and future challenges?
If I can give a view on that, I mean, I think one thing I always say is like, AI is not magic, it's all based on data. So the more we engage with the idea of data, the more we can contribute. So there's lots of things we do that if we maybe don't use the word information, evidence, those terms so much and think about data, our skills are super relevant to the management, stewardship of data, things like finding data, preserving data, making sure that people share data. We do that with information and knowledge without even thinking. I'm not sure we've begun as a profession to use the word data enough, but once we do, we'll see many of our skills really transfer across. And that's why I'm very positive about how information, knowledge and library and information professionals can play a role in this area.
Thank you, Andrew. And I guess that business about once we start to do more starts to feed in to some of the questions about how far this stuff is understood and how far people can already know about it. So I'm going to go to Katie first. And Katie is saying, how might we as professionals help shift attitudes from fear and anxiety around use to being more positive about it? I guess the proof's in the pudding, isn't it?
I think we need to help people be AI literate. And that means things like, well, trying out these generative AI tools, seeing what they can do for yourself, but taking a critical eye at the kind of information they produce, the quality. And when I think people engage with the tools, they do see, wow, this is fantastic, but also it's super limited and is never really going to replace humans, well, not in the foreseeable future, I believe, in most roles.
Okay.
So I think it's about getting people to engage with the tools and think about their impacts.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of more questions now, and then I'm going to come back to some of the last two questions that have just come in when we have the broader discussion at the end. So just coming back to these, Anthea's asking around how to get people on board, and that's not just ourselves, but our colleagues and our clients, the people we're here to serve. That's one question. And then I'll come to Lucia's question, and then we'll come over to you, Kelcey. So the question at this point is, how do we get people, you know, our clients, our professions, you know, not ourselves, but the people we're working with and the people we're there to support? How do we get them on board with AI, particularly when I don't know that they'll necessarily know that they're using it, Andrew, and they won't, you know, this is being introduced in many ways by stealth, and I'm not sure people are aware of how far they're using machine learning and AI functions anyway.
That's an interesting one. I mean, from my perspective, if you look at how students use AI, they're much further ahead than most academics. They're interested, they're worried about the effect on unfair means and being seen to sort of cheat by using AI. So they really want clear rules, and it's quite hard to provide them. But I think a lot of users are really excited about their tools. I think our role is to encourage even more to do so, but also to inform them about limits, like things like sustainability impacts, things like use of copyright material to train these models. Just encouraging them to explore, ask questions about the tools they're using, and not, well, I hesitate to use the word the tools they're using. They're not just tools. There's a whole commercial motive behind them. They should be asking questions about that. So I think there's a lot of users are really engaged.
Interesting. I mean, those issues around copyright, use of third-party content, feeding the training resource of this stuff is certainly very relevant in my field. Lucia's asked a couple of questions which touch on what you just said, which is how far can we assume that students coming into into higher education are prepared to work with AI effectively for study and professional purposes? I'd hazard a guess that not very much would be the answer, because I think it's so dispersed and taking a natural sort of
I think there's a very strong desire to learn about it, though, because I think a lot of the students we talk to, they're thinking, well, my future employment is partly dependent on my getting up to speed on these tools. So there's definitely a thirst for knowledge. There's an interest. There's also quite a lot of fear about this issue of unfair means. So we in the academic institutions need to clarify that. And we need to find also, and it'd be quite good to hear from the audience here about that, how is AI, what skills do you really need in the workplace with AI? That's what students want to know and what they want to be taught about. So the more we can learn about that, the better.
Thank you. So really good questions coming through, but I'm going to come over to you, Kelcey, now. Kelcey, it's fabulous that you've decided to join us today from the Cabinet Office. We're really, really thrilled to have you, and I very much enjoyed our earlier conversation. You've got a really fascinating background, sort of creativity, digital humanities, archive. So look, I'm going to hand straight over to you. You've got masses of experience in this field, and you're going to come in and talk to us about, you know, some of the more detailed applications and what's possible. Over to you.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to preface this with a complete disclaimer about imposter syndrome, because I've been working in the field of knowledge and information management for, I think, about 3 months. So I'm not in any way going to tell you how to do anything that you already know how to do. But I've started at the Cabinet Office recently because it was becoming apparent that the vast quantities of data we all have in our institutions or organizations can be sometimes somewhat insurmountable. And as you might imagine, at somewhere like Cabinet Office, we can't necessarily just use off-the-shelf software or systems or whatever, because there's a sensitivity level that might, I mean, like, we have to be careful where the servers are based in the world and things like that. So I was asked if I could come in first and just be a technical, I come from a digital humanities background, so a sort of technical problem solver with an understanding of archival data and materials. And as we all know, well, as I think is becoming apparent from our conversations, any AI systems need data, but vast amounts of data can be helped, classified and organized by the use of AI systems. So it could be a bit of a chicken and egg going on. So I'm going to talk today about a very particular interesting area that I've started working on, that is an application that I don't think is getting, I mean, it's not something that is headline news, but it's something you might, as professionals, find interesting. If I can work out how to share my screen, please share the right tab. That one. Can someone vocally confirm I'm sharing the right thing?
Yes, you are. We can see
Brilliant.
it. Thanks.
Thank you. So what I'd like to talk about is this idea of connecting knowledge and information computationally. Because, well, data is good, knowledge is better. And in a world with generative AI, those connections are massively important. Now, I'm not personally working in the field of generative AI where something is being created. There's no text coming out of this. Mostly what I need to do is classify, organize in some way. However, there is room for some of that. But at the moment, let's not worry about generative AI. I'm talking about the classification kind, as in putting things in buckets and working out what they are. Is this something worth retaining? Is this something that needs to be kept secure because it's not, it's got sensitivity issues, or so on. So why am I interested in connecting knowledge to data? Well, that's going to help, isn't it? And it all starts with this idea of named entity recognition, which, if you have heard of, essentially it's picking out the things in a document that are entities, humans, institutions, organizations, and there are loads of sort of pre-trained pipelines which you can apply to any text and it will just pop out. So what I've got on the right there is an example of an imaginary email or letter. Dear Elizabeth, it was lovely to meet you last week in Whitehall. I hope you visit me in Oxfordshire soon. Let me know, let me speak to the Home Secretary about your issue. Yours, David Cameron, Prime Minister. Right, completely innocuous email. And a few things by the default, I'm using Spacey here, if anyone knows it, it's a Python library, has picked out, Elizabeth, that's clearly a person. Last week, that's clearly a date. Great. It has not picked out Home Secretary as an entity, because that's quite a domain-specific entity, and nor has it picked out Prime Minister. So this is just an absolutely off-the-shelf algorithm that has been pre-trained on vast quantities of labeled data, which by labeled data, I mean, if you imagine just vast quantities of text with these like person, date, facility, global political entity, and so on and so on, all labeled on the text. It reads through it, it trains the algorithm, and then you give it more things and it goes, oh, I recognize these things from the context they were written in the training data, from the way the language works. And I will not go into any more detail about named entity recognition itself, because there's a vast wealth of actual algorithmic stuff that goes underneath it. The point is that it is possible to sort of pick out these things. So far, so good. The other side of this coin is the linked data sets. You, I assume, will have come across these, but if you haven't, let me give you a very brief overview. Linked data is a way of creating webs of knowledge that connect to entities or ideas using a syntactic, semantic connection. So in the example I've got here, don't worry about the top code for the second, look at the diagram on the bottom left. I've invented someone called Hugh Mann, and he has a birthplace of London and a birth date in 1955. Now, the reason there's labels on the arrows is because linked data comes to you in subject, predicate, object forms, by which I mean the subject is Hugh Mann, the predicate is birthplace, and the object is London. Now, London itself might be a subject of other things. In fact, London is obviously a subject of other things, because you could have London, capital of United Kingdom, for example. Birth date is another predicate, but in this case, it's connecting to a literal, it's a date. It doesn't have any, it is not an entity in itself. It is merely just a, like a set of numbers. But in this case, it's obviously an ISO date. So obviously, it's a lot more complicated than just writing things out in tables or in databases that are relationally connected. Why would we want to do this? Well, because there's a massive flexibility to connecting things like this. You don't have to have complete data sets. You don't have to have predetermined schemas. In this context, I am using schemas defined. So the concept of birthplace, I don't know if the text is too small to see there, but it is, I am borrowing something written by schema.org. They've said, use this thing called birthplace when you want to define, say that is something. Same with birth date. There are schemas and ontologies out there all over the internet that are designed for domain specific things or larger. So there's things called friend of a friend for how you can describe a person and their relationship to other person, description of a project, dope as it's called, and so on and so on. But these are just so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The idea is that you could connect your information, let's say you have a lot of siloed information. Well, you might want to unsilo that by connecting out to other places. And in this context, Human exists in some example.org space, which I don't know, I've invented, but it's connected to London, which exists in some dbpedia.org, which is a bit like Wikipedia, but linked data. So I can build my data set out into things that already exist. I don't need to reinvent them. And in my case, I might be working with government entities and connect them to parliament entities, which are almost the same, but not quite. And there's going to be a lot of crossover. So I don't necessarily need to reinvent things there. I can just connect to it. Obviously, it is harder to write. As you can see on the top left, there's a bit of a faff to the writing. You could be writing comma separated values, it'd be a lot easier. It's harder to read. It can be confusing. It is somewhat harder to search if you don't understand the wonderful world of Sparkle. So obviously there must be good reasons for using it. Let me move on. If I were to, and I have got a toy data set of people who have been in the top government roles for the last 14 years, the institutions within government that they have occupied and their incumbencies, by which I mean there is someone called David Cameron, and he was something called a prime minister. The prime minister existed in something called, I put him in the cabinet office, but the Home Secretary exists within the Home Office, and so on and so on. And their incumbency starts here and ends here. So if I were to create a toy data set of linked data that looked like that, and then I were to run the entity linking algorithm through that data set to pick out all of the names and define all the people as humans, as people, and define all the organizations as organizations. So the Home Office is an organization, it is not a person. And then I were to run the entity recognition algorithm again, and every time it picks one out, connect it to the thing it thinks it's found. So far, so good. But you'll see that it's now managed to find even less, because it is only finding where it already was finding an entity. It is now looking in the library, basically, for what entity might that be. And in this case, it's found Elizabeth and gone, I reckon that's Elizabeth Truss, Liz Truss. And it's found David Cameron and said, I reckon that's David Cameron. Fair enough. But it has not found previously. It found Oxfordshire, Whitehall, so on and so on and so on. But it found those as entities, but it couldn't find anything in the library to link it to. So it didn't go anywhere. Not so great. We've lost some information connection to knowledge here. There is a vast amount of work going on at the moment. It's a really big field at the moment about doing something called it's called wikification, because as you can tell from the case here, there's a lot of disambiguation, as a lovely Wikipedia term, of entities. So I'm an example here of, if you encounter the word Sheen, does it mean Michael Sheen, Charlie Sheen, Martin Sheen, East Sheen, or any other Sheen, or just the sheen on a coat of paint? You don't know without context. So this idea of entity linking and disambiguation and wikification is, can we grab from the context through training our data model, train the model, can we work out what sheen is being referred to in this block of text? For example, if we're talking about Hollywood films and I see the word sheen, it's probably going to be one of the first three. If I'm talking about roads in London, it's probably going to be East Sheen. But then can we go further than that? I mean, I'm not presuming this will be a humanly done process, but just from vast amounts of labeled training data, can you do that? Well, yes, you can. It's not perfect like any of these things, but it can be done. And then you can take any block of text, and the wikifying bit comes in when you were talking about connecting that then into Wikipedia or whatever, but that's not particularly what I'm interested in doing, but you could do that. So what would be a better approach to the one where we lost entities? Well, I could scour the knowledge graph that I've created of all my government entities for variations of names and acronyms and nicknames. Is it Elizabeth Truss or is it Liz Truss? A question I've still not answered. How does the Chancellor gets referred to as a 3-letter acronym that inside government that you don't hear outside, and I can't even remember right now. And I could put all of those in, and then I could do very complicated search things, probably using something like Elasticsearch, find where those names crop up, and then automatically or semi-automatically label data. Now, obviously, I can't go around doing that on some of the data I'm trying to do this on because of the nature of it. But fortunately, in my case, a lot of publicly available data, for example, newspapers and websites, will contain very similar writing styles, contexts, and names. So I could, for example, scour the RSS feeds of The Guardian and extract every time these people that I think I'm being talked about are in their context, run that through my algorithm, and then create a new pattern matching system so that it will recognize entities it previously didn't recognize. For example, we've just got a new permanent secretary at the Cabinet Office called Cat Little. Now, when I tried this at the beginning, that obviously was not a name that was recognized as a person. It was recognized as a cat, a small cat. But I can then train it, and seeing the name Cat Little often in the context of being a human, and then I'm adding to it with my linked data set saying, this is a person. I know this person is in my knowledge base. So we can then enhance our pipeline by training it to do exactly that. Find Cat Little, recognize it to be the Cat Little in the knowledge base. So the first part of that is not a machine learning step. It's just word searching and then tagging the contents to it. But then you can start to end up with something like this. So this is my experimentation. We're not talking about anything in production here. And you'll see that it is now recognizing the Prime Minister as a role, First Lord of the Treasury as a role, Boris Johnson as a person, Liz Truss and Elizabeth Truss are both the same person, as you'll see on the next slide, because the tags it's coming up with there are the exact tags in my toy data set of linked data. It is recognizing one Elizabeth Truss at the bottom, not, if I go back a slide, Liz Truss and Elizabeth Truss as separate things. So those would be the tags that come at the bottom. And I should just preface, in case these are not websites, the data.gov.uk person Sunak/Rishi, that's not a website. They are uniform resource identifiers, which look like websites, but are not necessarily. Sometimes they are. You might go to it and you'll find something in some mature data set that goes, this is represented by this URI, but they're not necessarily. It is just a unique identifier. All websites, all URLs of websites are also URIs, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the other way around is true. So yes, don't always try and click these things. Now, the next steps that I'm working on at the moment, for example, would be to create a corpus of these many domain-related terms. So gathering text from newspapers, from non-secure things that I can train stuff on. Include ambiguous terms, typos, acronyms, nicknames, and gather as many variations on the official names as possible, because you never hear the Prime Minister referred to as the First Lord of the Treasury. That will be a pointless thing without all of the other variations of PM, Prime Minister, and so on. Keep it public domain. Manual tagging is time consuming, so using this semi-automated way of tagging is a cheat. It's probably not as accurate, but then again, manual tagging is also not necessarily accurate because of the vast quantities that need to be done. Then train my linking algorithm on the corpus and then test its ability to do things. For example, encounter the word Michael in a 2015 document related to defence spending and hope it comes up with Michael Fallon, as opposed to a 1990s cabinet document which you would hope will come up with Michael Heseltine. So it's things like that that I'm interested in finding. Why would I want to do all this? Well, now we get to the point, which is in archival searching, or for example, freedom of information request searching, or something like that, I would like to be able to facilitate the team to be able to type things like, find me all the documents in the archive which are between the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary and David Cameron, where they talk about NATO and mention defence spending. And that, using generative AI systems, could be converted relatively easily into a query, which would then use this linked data, the entity recognition, the hyper tagging of these documents to return to their person exactly what they asked for. And that will be a wonderful world. And there's nothing I'm saying here that is not possible. It is just a lot of work. What is possibly impossible, or currently impossible, would be my second moonshot of a solution here, which would be, so I live in Newcastle on the Line, and my MP is Aaron Bell, but if I were to encounter a sentence that said, "Dear Aaron, it was nice to meet you in Newcastle, in your Newcastle constituency last week," there's nothing in that that tells me who Aaron is. There's nothing in that that tells me which Newcastle we're referring to. Could I, using those two entities that have been recognized, work out which Aaron or which Newcastle are we talking about? There's not an easy solution to that, and there's a bit of pathfinding involved that may be or may not be possible, but I'd like to keep inquiring in that direction, because that would be a really handy thing to be able to do, to disambiguate across vast amounts of data very quickly. Oh, sorry, I felt like I was going very quickly there to get through, but that's me.
Marvellous. Thank you very much indeed. And together those presentations have raised a whole series of questions. I'm going to group a couple of them up and put a few to you, and then if we've time, just ask people to put their hands up yet. But so look, the first one is this all a lot of hype? You know, we've seen stuff come, we've seen stuff go. Those of us have been around have seen, you know, all sorts of concerns. You know, is it a flash in the pan, or is it with us forever? So I'm going to go to you first, Andrew.
There is a lot of hype. It's easy to get caught up in it. But I don't think it is all hype. I mean, generative AI, if you look at how much it's used, how many users it's got, we're doing a bit of a study here on how students with a disability use generative AI and how they can help them overcome their writing problems. And I think it can do marvelous things, but it's got some limitations. But I think it's too easy to say it's all hype. Yeah.
Thank you. Kelcey, how would you say?
Yeah, I saw that question. I was really interested in it, especially because it was in relation to Google and Wikipedia. It's like, well, Google and Wikipedia weren't all hype either. They did kind of change the way everything works. You know, they haven't changed the world forever. It's not like we live in a Skynet future dystopia, but it did change the way things work, and this will too. And it you know, like Andrew says, there is hype, but it's not all unjustified.
Thank you. And perhaps before we go on to another question, there are a couple of points here about from a health perspective. The World Health Organization tells us that by 2030, which you'll realize is really very close now, there's going to be a shortfall globally of 18 million health workers. Okay. And if you then look at a Health Foundation and University of Oxford report, 44% of the administrative work in general practice could be automated. Now, it didn't really need machine learning or AI to do that, but nevertheless, if that speeds it up, you know, the point I would make is that when you've got a workforce shortage globally, the pace of the adoption of innovation accelerates to respond to that challenge. So that would be my perspective on it. Of course, organizations will seize on this. If you look at the amount of time that a physician spends on some of this, some administrative tasks, I think it will be, I definitely don't see it as a flash in the pan personally. There's quite a theme there around, well, where's the value that humans can add? Kim asked a question about, you know, is it that we add value to machine generated work? It's about taking the work out of the human and really allowing the human to dominate. and says how, you know, understanding how humans think and search. So where's that value? And related to that, you know, is there something about our contribution to the debate on the ethics of all this? And I'd add the safety of all this. What do you think, Andrew?
I think AI works when it thinks at all. It doesn't think like a human. It can process loads of information and find patterns in it at a speed we couldn't do. But making the key decisions has got to be human. And I think there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research has said, you know, what are the key, and in one of my slides, I didn't have time to talk to, what are the key skills you need in this AI-driven world. It is actually emotional intelligence, it's influencing skills, it's ability to address complex problems, those kind of things. And I think actually information professionals have been good at a lot of those things. Oh, yeah. So there's definitely, I don't think what is hyped is the idea that computers are just going to take over and do everything very efficiently. I think what we could enter is a world, one sort of dystopia that I see is AI that doesn't work that well. There's always messing things up, makes lots of mistakes, also systematically wrong mistakes, reflecting discrimination. And so we're always going to need human oversight, I think.
There's quite a bit of dialogue, which really, I think, reflects in the chat, which I think I'm going to raise this point and then ask people if they'd like to put their hand up and make some other points. I think there's a bit of chat which really reflects the fact that at a time like this, there's a lot of developments going on. You know, there'll be multiple solutions being developed. We won't all be aware of some of the solutions that we might be able to use. We're not going to you know, for those of us old enough, you know, how do we tell which one's going to survive Betamax or VHS? You know, how does this all play out? For me, that's less of a concern, because getting your sleeves rolled up and playing in the sandpit and learning about this stuff is as useful as thinking you've got anywhere near a solution that's going to last you more than 18 months. But, you know, I'd be interested to know how you both think about it. I'll come to you, Kelcey, first, if I might.
Yeah, well, I was getting slightly distracted by just thinking about the questions about the tools that we use. Now, yeah, I have to admit, any suggestion I'm rebuilding things that might already exist, I totally take that on board. I kind of have to. That's why I'm doing my job, is because I'm not making things from scratch. I'm using things that have been curated and maintained and written by incredibly intelligent people who know what they're doing way better than I do, that know the mathematics better than I do. The difference is I'm putting those Lego blocks together to make something which does exactly what I want to do and I have control over. What I'm not doing is asking Microsoft to come and step in and solve my problems for me without knowing how they're doing it, because they're using a proprietary system that they'll never tell me the answer to if I ask them. So I am a massive advocate of being in control of the tools you use and not being controlled by them. Now, I'm not proposing everyone goes away and learns the complete understanding of the mathematics behind a naive Bayes system, although it's interesting and I would recommend it if you were interested. But if you don't even know what the thing is doing, how can you possibly make an informed choice about if it was the right thing to use in the first place? Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure that was even really the answer to the question. I was sort of reading the questions on the side as well.
No, but really helpful, because it is challenging. And look, I'm gonna there's a lot of dialogue, and I think that will point to future discussions. Yeah, I think diving in, and there's lots of discussion here about short courses and training data, and courses on training data and algorithms. And I think, you know, that's something the two groups might want to take away and think about whether that's something they could work on together. And there's some sharing of useful courses. Is there anyone with something burning they really would like to say into the room before I move on to ask the two groups to give us a bit of an update on where they're at? If you'd like to put your hand up. And I see the references to copyright, by the way, and the later discussion, and there's something around copyright in the Q&A section as well. Is there anyone who'd really like to make a point into the wider group? Big group, I know, today. But don't kick yourself if you come off this call and think, I wished I'd said. Lucia.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for accepting me for this meeting. It's a question about the impact of research, academic research into the community. How much do you think there is scope for bringing all this research and educating, I wouldn't say the masses, but people who want to learn about these things in the community, who don't necessarily want to go to university, but want to work with these tools and do good for the community? And I'm referring to Professor Mark Reed's impact culture, how to bring and disseminate research impact into the community, not just between academics and politicians and industry. So is there scope? How much is there scope for teaching people in the community?
But I'm going to let the two gentlemen just form their thoughts while I just share with you that from an NHS perspective, we work, and from a CILIP perspective, we have a partnership based around health and digital literacy. Yeah. And that incorporates working with the NHS, with Libraries Connected, which is the public library network in England, with Arts Council England, as well as CILIP as the professional body. And actually, one of the things we really want to do is work out how we can provide learning materials for the general public in public library and other settings which cover algorithmic literacy, data privacy, as well as health literacy, because those data and digital literacies now and AI literacy is going to underpin your ability to have health information that you can use and interact safely with the health service. So just from a health service perspective, that dialogue is real. And I'll put my email address in there. And if you want to reach out, I'll connect you with one of my colleagues for another discussion on that. But if I can come to Andrew and Kelcey to follow up the same point, and then I'll close our discussion and come in quickly for 2 minutes each from our two professional bodies. And I'll come to Naeem and Gig first, if I may.
I mean, my thought is generative AI, particularly ChatGPT, has thrust AI into everybody's faces. It's in the news headline. I'm sure a huge number of people in the general public are engaging with these tools. They may not understand them, but it's stimulating interest in them. And I think they'll play about and they'll try and build their skills. So I think there's no danger that public imagination won't be caught. We've already seen that it has been. And there's a proliferation of different applications of generative AI, like in chatbots that imitate human characters and so forth. It's just, it is very accessible. So I think what we'll do is stimulate a lot of interest, people wanting to learn more about AI, whatever your background.
Thank you.
Kelcey?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, as you'd expect as a former academic, there's always conversations about impact of anything. But I guess the best argument is that I have friends who work in computer science departments that I have conversations with about AI. You know, they often sigh as soon as they hear those two letters. But their conversations often lead me to go away and think about something, and their research has an impact on sometimes what I do. In which case, you know, that's pretty big impact. I don't know about the wider community, because I've certainly worked on digital humanities projects where things will be working with a lot of volunteers, but often what would happen is they'd be shielded from some of the more technical stuff so as not to scare people away. So there's a lot to think about there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, a big thank you to the people who've organised this behind the screen, to you, Kelcey, to you, Andrew, and to everyone who's been involved. I will be asking the group leads to look at all the chat and see where that leads other directions onward. And Gus, am I right that the slides are shared afterwards in a PDF form?
Yeah, we will be looking to share them. The CILIP's AI Hub will probably be the first place they'll pop up, but we'll also look to push it via social channels.
And if I can ask people, if you're used to Zoom, to find the way in which we can all say thank you to our colleagues here. So thanks so much indeed. Really good job. And I know that you could all have spoken much longer, and no doubt you'll both be invited back at different times to share more of your experience and expertise and your observations in this field. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a good afternoon.